Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis. I'm beginning a new series on the U.S. foreign policy from the Revolutionary era to the present day, and I'll be joined by Keith Preston. Um, Thanks for coming on, Keith. It's always great having you.
Hi, Todd. Glad to be back.
Um, I'm thinking that there's 2 points I want to start off with the American foreign policy as it's developed over time. Pat Buchanan makes an interesting point that's certainly disputable in his book, A Republic, Not an Empire, where he says that America only became an imperial nation after McKinley, after the invasion of Spain, Cuba, and the Philippines. And now David Gordon, who wrote a book review of that in 2000 on uh, the Mises website, argued that it seems fairly odd that Buchanan would make that distinction because it seems somewhat arbitrary, given that America had been very expansionist. In fact, those expansionist tendencies led to friction with its colonial overlord Great Britain, as we'll get into a bit later. Um, and then once Gordon basically says, well, once you conquer from sea to sea, well, why not just go out into other countries? Because now, you're able to do that. Now, I think in Buchanan's defense, one point that is a sea change is, George Washington's farewell address had warned us of foreign entanglements. And at that point, after McKinley, that was thrown to the winds. So there is some distinction to be made, but I think Pat Buchanan overplays his hand. And after all, Madison and Adams in the Federalist Papers both described the United States as an empire of liberty. In fact, one of the arguments from the Federalist Papers was small republics always fail because they get conquered by larger neighbors, and that they wanted to create a large republic like Rome, an imperial republic that would be large enough to defend itself and preserve, as they saw it, the virtues of liberty. So, do you have anything to say or add to this sort of starting off point here?
Well, I think the problem with Buchanan's analysis is that he seems to only focus on overseas imperialism that has been engaged in by the United States throughout its history. He seems to have this idea that the American westward expansion, or even American expansionism into Latin America or the Pacific during the 19th century, was somehow not imperialistic or was somehow not an empire. And I think David Gordon was absolutely correct when he said that that's a bit of an arbitrary distinction. I think that Buchanan's has this idea that America is basically the continental United States that Americans were somehow entitled to, and that things only started to go off track and when the United States began to become embroiled in the politics of Europe and Asia. And I think that that's a fairly limited critique of U.S. imperialism. I think you're right in the sense that if we go back and look at the founding documents of the United States and what the people who founded the United States actually believed, we see that what they were trying to do was create what amounted to a reconstruction of the Roman Republic in North America. And right from the start, they had this idea of, as you said, an empire of liberty, something that would expand westward continually. I mean, if we go back and we read the writings of early American leaders as far back as the 18th century, they're talking about all of the lucrative resources that are to the west and to the south in what's now called Latin America. We have to consider that one of the principal contributing factors to the American Revolution itself was the fact that the colonies were continually trying to expand westward, and the British were resistant to this for a range of reasons. One reason is that the British did not want to have the colonies constantly engaged in war with the American Indian nations. And one of the causes of the revolution was the fact that the British would not provide troops to cover the Western expansion as it was going on, and that the American Indians would retaliate, and there would be violence there. And that it even talks about that in the Declaration of Independence, about how the British have failed to protect the colonies from the so-called merciless Indian savages. And what that was about was the westward expansion that was going on, and then the skirmishes with the American Indian nations that were actually taking place. So that we see this kind of expansionism really even before the United States as a nation was even created. Even the colonies themselves were expansionist in nature. And then the United States is formed as an independent republic, modeled very closely on the Roman Republic, and it continues to expand westward. It continues to expand into all of the American Indian territories. What about the Trail of Tears? I mean, one of the ways that the Southern plantation system got started and really developed into what it was in the early 19th century is the fact that you had all of these American Indian nations. There were about 5 major American Indian nations, like the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Creek, and the Seminoles, that were based in the southeastern region of the United States. And a lot of the plantation interests wanted to continue to expand westward, and they wanted this territory, and that led to the passing of the Indian Exclusion Act of 1830, that in turn led to the Trail of Tears, where 5 American Indian nations were forcibly relocated westward. About a third of the people that were relocated died during this time. And all of this is long before the Civil War, before the Mexican War, before many decades before the Spanish-American War or the Philippine War, or any of these things that are supposed to be the turning point that lead into the formation of the American Empire.
Yeah, a couple of points here. I think it's illustrative, since we seem to agree that the United States was originally conceived as an expansionist polity. I think maybe in two points that are interesting to explain the origin of that ideology. The United States has both a secular and a Puritan tradition that often converge at points. The Puritan tradition views this as the new Israel, and the Indians were perceived as the Canaanites. The preacher Ezra Stiles in 1783 said that the Native Americans were the new Canaanites, and we, as the people of God, had the right to exterminate them to gain the land for ourselves. But we also have as well this kind of New Atlantis mentality. Bacon, I think it was Francis Bacon, the Renaissance Bacon, wrote a book called The New Atlantis, where he talks about, it's more of an allegory of this sort of enlightened nation of science and learning that, it was lost and was now recently discovered. And the United States has kind of seen itself as this embodiment of Enlightenment principles of, freedom and liberty and human rights and whatever you want to call those values. And those values itself are also demanding, right? All the other people that aren't, humanists or don't believe in liberty are reactionary and tyrannical and must be deposed, as we often hear with all the saber rattling with Assad right now. And so we have converging this Puritan element and this sort of secular Enlightenment element, both justifying an expansionist American empire at the expense of the Native Americans. They're dehumanized in different ways, right? They're dehumanized from the Puritan perspective as being examples of Canaanites. And from the Enlightenment perspective, they're dehumanized as being ignorant savages that are standing in the way of progress and reason.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right in that these two things are set the tone for the whole ideological mood of what the United States becomes. This kind of Puritan religious messianism on one hand, and this kind of secular Enlightenment messianism on the other hand. These two things converge, and it's sort of like the idea that America becomes God's chosen nation to spread the Enlightenment throughout the world, or something like that. It's a very strange convergence of ideas. In fact, there was an essay written back in the late 60s by Robert Bellah. Robert Bellah was a sociologist of religion, and he wrote this essay called The Civil Religion in America, which outlined this idea of what the American civil religion is, as it can be identified in the speeches of leading public figures going back to the founding generation. And he talks about how this civil religion is not Christianity. It may borrow some from the language of Christianity, but it's more like a kind of nationalistic deism, in the sense that it has the idea of America as God's chosen nation, and America has this special historic mission to bring freedom and democracy or whatever to the world, and that idea, this civil religion, has always existed. It goes back to the founding generation. You see it during the Civil War period. I mean, there were even songs written about it, like the Battle Hymn of the Republic. I mean, if you actually read the lyrics to that, that's exactly what it is. It's this American civil religion, and then it continues to take on new forms. Like right now, there's one form that's dominant. Perhaps there was another form that was dominant during the the middle 20th century, and then perhaps there was another form that was dominant during the era of the Philippine War and that kind of thing. But there's always been this ideological foundation to American imperialism that has this kind of messianic zeal behind it. It's really interesting and does represent a fairly strange convergence of ideas that I don't think we really see in any other nation from what I'm familiar with.
Yeah, I would agree. Given the sort of theological tenets of deism and those of the Puritan Presbyterians and Congregationalists, it's an awfully strange amalgamation. But one of the key incentives for the founding generation to rebel against the English was the Royal Proclamation of 1763, so after the French and Indian War, the North American front of the 7 Years' War, the French Empire, which covered most of the Ohio Valley, much of the West, was divided between England and Spain along the Mississippi River. And everything east of the Mississippi went to England, everything west went to Spain. And between the Appalachians and the Mississippi, the British had said, by law, you cannot settle beyond the Appalachians. And that was also seen as the Indian Reserve Act. And the colonists, with this expansionist tendency, didn't like that. They wanted to go all the way to the Pacific. And so that was one component of the American incentive to go to war with England.
Yeah, I think you're right. Well, I also think that a major issue was probably the fact that the anti-slavery movement was starting to develop in England as well. England was really the first modern nation to really eradicate the slave trade, and I suspect a lot of slave interest in the colonies understood that. They saw the writing on the wall as far as what was happening there as well, and they thought that independence would be a way to prevent the abolition movement from spreading to North America. But the issue is that if you look at how the first generation of American leaders and the ones after that as well, if you look at how they viewed Europe and how they viewed the American Indians as well, on one hand, they viewed themselves as the superior enlightened people, and they viewed the American Indians as these barbarian savages on one hand, and they also viewed the Spanish as this reactionary, traditional monarchical society. So they were, there's always been in American politics a kind of contempt for old Europe. Like even recently, even relatively recently, when the Iraq War was going on and some of the European nations declined to support the American war effort, there were leading American figures even in the 21st century, Donald Rumsfeld and some others, I think, who were talking about old Europe. Those old Europeans over there, those reactionaries. They don't know what they're doing, while we were over here liberating the world. That seems to have been a strand in American political culture ever since the beginning, and you see it during the westward expansion with particular vigor. This whole idea that the Americans are this chosen nation, and they're these American Indian nations they're not even human. They're just like glorified animals, and they have a similar view of the Europeans. The Europeans are this backward reactionary culture that we've broken away from. It's somewhat odd today when we hear nationalists talk about, when we hear European nationalists talk about the America as an outpost of European civilization. I tend to disagree with that. I tend to think that America was more of a repudiation of European civilization as much as it was an outgrowth of it on one hand, but it was a repudiation on the other hand. I gave a speech at National Policy Institute once where I said that, America is to Europe what Frankenstein's monster was to Dr. Frankenstein. It was a creation that got out of control and went crazy. And I think that's kind of the the way that the relationship between the United States and Europe has been historically.
That's actually a really good analogy. I don't think the English really planned on having this happen when
Yeah.
they first settled here. Um, within the American Revolution, another thing we can see is to highlight the aggressive expansionism, even in the birthing of our country, was what is one of the first things that we do in 1775 and 1776. We invade Canada. I mean, we invade Canada, and it was perceived to be a weak and soft target, which would offer, because of the controlling of the straits and the fur trade, would give us an economic advantage. But we ultimately were not prepared for Canada, and we would later invade again in 1812. So, man, the most powerful empire in the world, we're fighting for our life, and the first thing we do is we invade Canada. It just kind of shows you how, aggressive and devil-may-care the Americans are.
Yeah, well, it's interesting to go back and actually look at what happened during the Revolutionary War in the late 18th century. There were hundreds of thousands of refugees that were created by that war, many of whom went to Canada during the course of the war. And there was a lot of, in the colonies, there was a lot of vigilante violence against Tories, against English loyalists. A lot of those fled to Canada. It's also interesting to consider the historical trajectory that the United States has followed and compared to other nations that were once English colonies, like Canada, like Australia, like New Zealand. What we see today is that Canada and Australia and some of these other nations of the Anglosphere that are outgrowths of the British Empire in the same, with pretty much the same history, managed to be successful modern functional societies without having a violent revolution where they broke off with the empire itself. So that calls into question the whole legitimacy, I think, of the American Revolution. I know there's a lot of libertarian types who say, well, there were only two good wars in American history, or three good wars, and one is always the Revolution, and then another one is usually the World War II, and sometimes they're dependent on your predilections. There's the Civil War or the War of Southern Independence or whatever. But
yeah, Rothbard said the Civil War was one of the good ones for the South.
Yeah, but the more I look at the American Revolution, the more I come to the point of view that what was the point? I mean, it was. Again, like today, talking about freedom, I mean, today the Americans, the Canadians, and the Australians have roughly the same liberties, with some differences, I guess, but pretty much the same. And so for that matter, do the British. So it's they're all pretty much the same civilization, same basic culture, same basic politics. But it does seem, though, that the American first generation of Americans that came out of the American Revolution were very much about revolting against the empire, not just for independence, but for expansionist purposes. The empire, it's like they viewed their status as colonies, as an albatross that prevented expansionism. And it's not merely that they wanted independence, but that they wanted to remove the constraining hand of the British Empire as a means of moving westward and building an empire.
Exactly. It's almost like the United States revolted against two things: what it perceived to be the chains of westward expansion that were placed on it by the British, and against, as they perceived it, the reactionary culture of the British monarchy. It wasn't, enlightened enough. They wanted to have a pure Enlightenment society, and England was just a good deal too reactionary for that. Well, I have to agree with your assessment on the American Revolution. About 100,000 people probably died in that conflict. And given that, as you pointed out, other English colonies like Canada, Australia, New Zealand have come out very, very well. I mean, they didn't have to fight a bloody civil war to gain large levels of autonomy, and they've preserved the same institutions of rule of law and civil society that we Americans take for granted. So, was it really worth 100,000 lives to acquire what would have happened probably anyhow?
Yeah, that's something interesting to consider. Bringing that idea to the table in American political culture is obviously going to be considered heresy, because then it pretty much detracts from the legitimacy of the 4th of July and all of that. But from a purely logical perspective, it does seem to have been the case that the United States has turned out pretty much the same as all of these other former British colonies, but none of those had a civil war that led to hundreds of thousands of casualties in the same way that the United States did. And when I say Civil War, I mean the American Revolution. And then, of course, there was the second, the next Civil War, the one we call the Civil War, which was even worse. And again, same thing happened there. I mean, we're getting ahead of ourselves here, but the same thing happened there. I mean, the slavery was ended in all of these other places without that kind of bloodshed. So it's interesting how the United States follows such a bloody trajectory throughout its history. It's like one bloody war after another, and there's always some high-minded ideal associated with it. There was always some kind of supposed high-minded ideal. It's like we're the original Trotskyites or something.
Well, exactly, because abolishing slavery everywhere else in the world was more or less peaceful. The English colonies getting their rights more or less peaceful. It's like America has to find the most violent way to solve a problem, because when you have a really big hammer and it's your army, everything turns out to be a nail. And if you have a powerful army, but we didn't have a powerful army in the Revolution. England had the powerful army, so it's like our ideology compelled us to that way. But the other point I was going to make out is the sort of aggressiveness of the American spirit. Is so many presidents cut their teeth fighting Native Americans. You had Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Which president was that? William Henry Harrison. Yeah, he fought in the war against Tecumseh, and then it was the Black Hawk War. I think you had Jackson fought down in Tennessee against those people. And so many presidents in the early republic cut their teeth as Indian fighters, and that was kind of like their bragging rights. We're Indian fighters.
Yeah, that was a fundamental component of what was considered to be an ideal leader in early America. We're talking pre-Civil War, antebellum America. Is many of the presidents from that time period. That's what they were. They were military officers, and what did they do? They were wage war against American and Indian nations.
Exactly. Now, after the American Revolution, actually, there's one important point I want to bring out here too, with American foreign policy. The American Way of War, which was written by Russell F. Weegley, very influential book. It ends, I think, right before Vietnam, because it was published right before Vietnam. And he talks about how American policy changed, and we'll get into the details later. But in the beginning, we had a more of an irregular warfare style tactic. Militias, bushwhackers, snipers, and the British really hated that. And then with the Civil War, we begin to change into a war of annihilation. Now, in part against the Native Americans, who were always the weaker force in any of these fights, the war of annihilation was always practiced. Against the British and the Mexicans, we pursued more of an indirect method of fighting because we were weaker. But when we were stronger, we did have the war of annihilation against Indians. But then once the Civil War comes to place, America's strong enough to wage a war of annihilation without fear of reprisal. And I think America only ever pursued a policy of indirect warfare because we were weak. Our national spirit impelled us to a war of annihilation, and once we were strong enough to implement it universally, we did.
Yeah, I think that if you look at the history of American war, there's a great deal of brutality involved in American war right from the beginning. The form of warfare that the Americans had inherited from Europe was the old line and column model of warfare that had developed over the past several centuries before that. And this is something that had almost made war into almost like a sport. I mean, it wasn't really a sport. People still got killed and all that. But compared to modern war, it was almost like a sporting event in many ways, although obviously a high stakes one. And the American Revolutionary War was, in many ways, a break from that, in the sense that it was the Americans that started to learn how to use tactics like ambushes and more like modern guerrilla warfare. And then that seems to expand over time to where it's not just about defeating the enemy; it's about totally annihilating their civilization. Of course, with the American Indians, the Americans viewed those as subhuman. They were just, but another thing to consider is that the ideas people had about things like race and ethnicity back then were such that they tended to view the Native Americans as sort of like an animal species with vocal cords, basically. That's kind of how they viewed the Native Americans and blacks as well. So that's important to consider. But the violence, though, that you see right from the start of the United States and its westward expansion is really extraordinary. I mentioned the Indian Exclusion Act earlier and the Trail of Tears. When the Indian Exclusion Act was passed, it actually went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court Justice John Marshall actually found it to be unconstitutional. And the president, Andrew Jackson, said, okay, Justice Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it, meaning, well, we're not going to pay any attention to what the court says because we've got the army, so it's business as usual. That essentially meant that the United States was functioning as a military dictatorship at the time. And it was a genocidal one. It was one that was literally exterminating whole nations during the course of the Western expansion.
Another point that I want to add to the development of the American military ethos is Lawrence Keeley in his excellent book, War Before Civilization, where he completely obliterates the mythology of the peaceful prehistoric past. He makes an interesting observation that most tribal warfare, this would be between people of 100 to 500 people, combat on that level, is often total war. Men, women, and children are considered valid targets to be killed or captured or mutilated. And what happens is you'll have, in the United States, we saw this dichotomy. On the East Coast in the 1860s and 70s, a lot of the Easterners were sympathetic and developed the idea of the noble savage. But on the frontier, they had a more aggressive policy against them because they lived right up close with them. And not that American foreign policy or military ethos needed any spurring to be aggressive and violent, but the inherent nature of tribal warfare of being a kind of like total war. The per capita death tolls are far higher in tribal conflicts, but the total population is much lower, so fewer people end up dying. But per capita, it's huge. And I think at one point there's a massacre in the Great Plains where the Sioux exterminated their tribal enemies, the Cheyenne. Like 80% of the tribe was wiped out in that conflict. The Cheyenne tribe or something like that. It was the Pawnee tribe, my bad. Because the Pawnee later became U.S. Scouts, in part because the Sioux were beating up on them. So not that we need any help, but the Indian method of fighting certainly fed that desire for an aggressive military confrontation.
Well, you can see parallels to that in the wars that took place between the Europeans and the native peoples in Latin America as well, with the Aztecs and so forth. The colonial wars that happened between, say, the Spanish and the Portuguese and some of the native civilizations in Latin America became that as well, but where it became a war of total extermination. The Europeans had kind of developed this method of warfare that was, like I said, it was more like a sporting event. I think a lot of that came out of the 30 Years' War. Because the 30 Years' War was so brutal and so deadly, there was a lot of aversion to large-scale warfare that came after that. First, the private war was outlawed. The making of war was ceded to the state, and even wars between states became sort of a sporting event for a time. And I think, though, that when the conquest of the New World started, I think it was a return to the kind of barbarian warfare that Europe had experienced in the past. It was more warfare the way the Romans did it or the way the Germanic tribes did it. And it was probably in part influenced by the fact that you did have very brutal forms of warfare that existed already in the Western Hemisphere between the various indigenous nations and things like that. So and then the Europeans sort of blend into that when they start conquering the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah. I think the next major foreign policy interest is the War of 1812, or as they said, Mr. Madison's War back in the day. There were three, largely speaking, three groups in the American country by that point that exerted foreign policy influence, and that maintained itself for quite some time. You had the South, which at that point was controlled by the plantation owners. You had the North, which was controlled by the mercantilist classes, and then you had the West, which was controlled by essentially the populace. Now, in the War of 1812, the mercantilists in the North were very much against the war because they made trade with England. In fact, I think Massachusetts refused to raise levies or militias to go fight the war, and there was even the rumblings of secession from New England. Now, the West wanted war to get Canada. They assumed Canada would be a soft target. I guess they didn't learn the lesson from the American Revolution. It wasn't quite so soft. And the Southern plantation owners were favorable to expansion southward into Mexico, into further west as well. And so the driving expansion domestically was from the West, with the West at that point would have been Ohio and Michigan, Illinois, and Indiana. And the South at that time would have been like, Virginia, Mississippi, Tennessee. And they would have been pushing for expansion to grow America's borders. Now, one of the things is the pretext was England had impressed U.S. sailors during the Napoleonic Wars in order to bolster their navy to help defeat the French and Napoleon. Now, the funny thing is, the day that we declared war on United Kingdom, or Great Britain rather, was when they had repealed the policy of kidnapping U.S. sailors, which really shows that it was more of a pretext than than a real moral casus belli, because the British stopped doing it. But I think we wanted Canada. The Western Warhawks, Henry Clay being one of the leading advocates, believed that Canada could greatly expand. We just wanted land, really. Americans just wanted land. We didn't care where we got it from. And even to back it up, the Louisiana Purchase, where Jefferson bought land from France. The funny thing is, I think he had to violate the Constitution to actually do that, didn't he, Keith?
Yeah, well, there's nothing in the Constitution that authorized the purchase of massive territory at the cost of millions of dollars in 1803 money. It's interesting because if you go back and look at constitutional issues that came up during that time period, when James Madison was in Congress, someone wanted to appropriate some funds for the assistance to refugees or something like that. And Madison voted against it in Congress, saying, I can't really see where the Constitution authorizes this. But then Jefferson came along and appropriated $15 million in 1803 money, which would be probably hundreds of millions today, and for the purpose of buying this massive territory from the French, it's very difficult to see how the Constitution would have allowed for that. At least as the Constitution was understood and interpreted at the time, the original Constitution. Since then, constitutionalism has just come to mean whatever those in power wanted to mean. But I guess that was true back then as well too. But there was some idea back then. Well, the Constitution is the law of the land, and we need to go by it. And now that's not really the case. But
one more point I want to make about 1812. The Southern Hawks were encouraged to go to war because, against Napoleon, Spain and England were allies, and they wanted to annex Florida. In part, I think, because a lot of escaped slaves would flee to Florida into the bayous and marshes down there with the Seminole Indians, and they wanted to close that loophole up. So, being an ally of England, going after England could give them a pretext to going after Florida. And so the Western Warhawks and the Southern Warhawks were beating the war drums to go to war with England. And New England, making a lot of money, was like, we don't really want to go to war right now because we're making so much money with England. And that's kind of the lay of the land at the time that this happens. Was there anything you'd like to add to that description there, Keith?
Yeah, well, it is important to consider as well how important slave-owning interests were to the shaping of American policy in every area back then, not only foreign policy, but economics and lots of other things. It was only later that the big falling out happened between the North and the South over the issue of slavery and all the other issues that were implicit in that. The slave-holding interests were like the Fortune 500 corporations today. I mean, they were a major economic power. They had a great deal of representation in Congress and in the rest of the government. A lot of the leading military figures at the time came from the slave-owning states, and the northern states initially did not have the aversion to slavery that they came to have later. Like it was in the North that the abolitionist movement and all that developed, and some of the individual states actually threatened to secede over slavery and stuff like that in the North. But initially, though, the northern states were certainly willing to accommodate slavery, and they certainly had similar views on race. I mean, there was a massive discrimination against, say, blacks or anyone else in the northern states as well. So it's important to remember how important slave-owning interests were to the formulation of policy in every area back then. And preventing slaves from escaping or curbing any possibility of an insurrection or revolt by slaves was also a major consideration whenever any kind of issues came up.
Yeah, exactly. But what do you agree with a sort of like tripartite regional division of policy interests?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we see that even at later points in U.S. politics as well. We've always seen something of a, maybe not so much nowadays perhaps, but for a long time we always saw a very strong division between the North, South, and the West in domestic U.S. politics. Nowadays, the American nation tends to be more integrated, even if it's very divided in an ideological sense. But yeah, I mean, it's certainly true that the North was dominated by merchants, the South by agricultural interests, and the North, the West by territorial expansionism. And it's always been in the Western states, for example, that this kind of American populist tradition has emerged. You have that coming along even in the 20th century. You see this kind of Western populism that's rooted in this kind of Marlboro country frontier concept. You have aspects of that today that are remnants of that. Like one example of these sovereign citizen groups. These sovereign citizen groups that believe that driver's license requirements are just a horrible abridgment of individual liberty. That's the legacy of our having once been a frontier society, and in particular the culture that was developed during in the Western states. That's where all of that stems from.
Yeah, exactly. This is not directly a part of the United States, but is a very important aspect of U.S. foreign policy, is the Mexican and then later Texan revolutions. So in the 1810s, during the Napoleonic Wars, leading into the 1820s, Mexico fights for independence against Spain. Spain being occupied by France is hardly capable of offering much resistance. And as do many other countries in Latin America at the time. And Mexico gains all of the land that is today, of course, Mexico. And then north of the Rio Grande, including places like California, Nevada, Texas, Oklahoma, Utah. And in the 1930s, 20s, and 30s, the funny thing is we talk about Mexican illegal immigrants today, but the quote-unquote first illegal immigrants were Western frontiersmen settlers trickling into Texas to make their fortune. And they became eventually a very influential component within Texas itself, to such a point where they then revolted against Mexico to gain their independence. Now, shortly thereafter, they filed for statehood. So one wonders, was this a sort of an American attempt to subvert a neighboring country and take away one of its provinces? And then, of course, in the national mythology, we have the Alamo, where which ultimately led to these pretexts. Ultimately led to the war with Mexico, that would take place and strip them of all the lands, most of the lands north of the Rio Grande. But with the Travis and Bowie and Crockett all dying at the Alamo, was a great sort of a Thermopylae moment for America, right? The few outnumbered, bravely holding out against overwhelming odds. But that sort of western frontier expansion, when they started to trickle in the trappers and the hunters and the people just trying to make their own fortune any way they could. When enough of the Anglos came into Texas, they then revolted against the Mexicans, and then of course fed into American expansionism. And the South and the West converged on Mexico and Texas as a similar goal because they both saw as advancing their interests. Texas could be a new slave state, and the Western expansionists would just get more land for the great American experiment.
Yeah, and it's interesting to note how many people today have no idea that Texas was once an independent nation. I'm always amazed at a number of Americans who have no clue that that's the case. But it is interesting, though, because one argument that the left constantly raises is, well, when people complain about immigration today, don't they understand that that whole Southwest region was actually once Mexican territory, and the way that it became part of, well, and with Texas being an independent nation at one point, but the way it became part of the United States was largely through annexation. And they kind of have a point with that. In fact, I know I had a British nationalist tell me once, he says, I don't even understand how Americans can be opposed to immigration if you look at their history. Which is an interesting take on it. And I think one that has some accuracy. But what we simply see the Americans doing is annexing one sovereign nation after another. I mean, the Americans achieved their independence for the colonies. They attempted to, as you've pointed out, they tried to annex Canada. They did successfully conquer a range of Native American nations. They annexed Texas. Of course, they later expanded into Hawaii and all of that as well. Vermont was once an independent nation that was incorporated into the United States as well. So we see right from the start this kind of effort to essentially gobble up this whole North American continent and incorporate it into this American empire. I think in some ways, perhaps it can be American expansionism in the 19th century can be compared to Napoleon, to the Napoleonic Wars, which were all about building this French empire that was supposedly bringing the Enlightenment to Europe. That's largely what the rationale behind the Napoleonic Wars were. And I think that all of this is really just the American version of the Napoleonic Wars. I mean, the United States and France both had this kind of Enlightenment influenced, almost messianic ideology, certainly a revolutionary ideology. And it was all about expanding it to these, backward people on the rest of the continent, in North America for the Americans and in Europe for the French.
Yeah, that's actually a very good point. I never really looked at it that way, but you can easily see how America, after the French Revolution, did consider France a sister republic. And Jefferson specifically did so. That's why he wasn't really too happy with the whole quasi-war thing. He said, we should be on the same side here. But, it really is quite brutal when you look at how we just subjugate all these sovereign states around us. One of the interesting things is Florida, when in, I think it was 1821 period, Jackson ended up buying Florida from the Spanish. But the Seminole tribe of Indians that lived in Florida, and because of its inaccessible marshlands, a lot of not just escaped slaves, but just people that were on the bottom of the social ladder would try to escape into the Florida. And there was a lot of racial mixing, and the Seminoles were an important force there. And the United States 3 times tried to bring the Seminoles to heel. And each time the Seminoles were able to fight the U.S. government to a standstill. And we're the only Indian tribe in the United States that did not have to sign a horribly unequal treaty that stripped them of their lands and their rights. And it's also interesting that William Tecumseh Sherman, who would become infamous later on, cut his teeth against the Seminoles. And one of his conclusions he drew from fighting the Seminoles was the way that you beat them is you just have to round them up and kill them all.
Yeah, well, a lot of the tactics that were used during the American Civil War were derivative of what had been used during the Indian Wars previously. As you pointed out, a lot of the generals in the Union Army were, in fact, generals that had cut their teeth fighting in these Indian Wars, before the U.S. Civil War. In fact, after the U.S. Civil War, the next step for the Union Army was to continue these kinds of attacks on the Native American nations further to the west. The history of Florida that you mentioned is interesting as well. Florida really was sort of I guess you could call a vagabond territory or something like that. It was sort of a refuge for all sorts of folks that were escaping the influence of the dominant American civilization. It was kind of almost like the Zamia region of Southeast Asia or something. This kind of primitive area where you had all of these people that were from the bottom of the social ladder congregating. I don't know that a whole lot of history has been research has been done on that history, but it is an interesting time period. Back to what I was saying earlier about the relationship between the French and the Americans, it really is, I think, an issue important to recognize that the American Revolution and the French Revolution were really variations of the same impulse. This was the Enlightenment coming to power, and there are some American-style conservatives, that is, people who want to be conservatives on one hand, but they want to be American nationalists on the other hand, that try to deny this in a way that I think is really strange. Russell Kirk was a great example. Russell Kirk always tried to say that.
So was Rushdoony too.
What was who?
That was Rushdoony. He also wanted to claim that American Revolution was a conservative movement.
Yeah, I suspect he probably lifted some of his ideas from Russell Kirk, because Russell Kirk was the one that really tried to popularize this idea. But there are some American-style conservatives, different type, who have tried to claim, well, the American Revolution was not a revolution; it was actually a conservative counter-revolution against liberal England or something like that, which is about as bizarre as it comes. I mean, how anybody could read the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution and the Federalist Papers, not to mention the personal papers of the first generation of American leaders, and come to that kind of conclusion is just really as bizarre as it gets. I mean, that's clearly the case of somebody bending historical facts to get the ideological conclusion they want.
I think one interesting point to hit on that we need to maybe expand a little bit more is the Trail of Tears. One of the things I think that's very illustrative of the Trail of Tears is the Native Americans were sort of offered, sort of like two, kind of like, the image we have of Islam, convert or die. The Native Americans were kind of given two options: either accept American Enlightenment culture and you live, or if you don't, we'll just kill you. It's kind of an Islamic mentality of convert or die. Now, the tribes that were expelled from Georgia during the Trail of Tears, the Cherokee, the Muskogee, the Seminole, the Chickasaw, and the Choctaw, all of them had more or less modernized into Americans. They had printing presses, they owned slaves, they had their own constitution. They had really adopted American political culture. And even that wasn't enough to protect them. The other tribes that kept to their ancestral ways, you could say, well, the convert or die, the Islamic fatwa, that we issued them, they just weren't going to go. But it showed that even giving into American culture, even accepting their principles, their technology, wasn't going to make you're still a target. You weren't safe.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's very similar to Bolshevism. With these communist states of the 20th century, I mean, they would wage war against rival socialists, against other communist states that didn't meet their standards. That was that's something that was continued for 200 years now, and it's interesting to see how all of that has its prototypes in stuff that came out of the late 18th and early 19th century. It really is this kind of enforcing this kind of ideological conformity, and in a way that's used for the purpose of masking just an old-fashioned imperialist ambition.
Yeah, exactly. I think probably the most important thing to take away is that modern-day liberalism, in its view of the state, is the way the narrative typically goes is we have these nasty wars of religion when these, simple-minded, stupid religious people were killing each other over, was the body and blood of Christ, was it in the Eucharist or not? And then we have these, enlightened liberals that came along and said, no, let's just take religion out of politics. And then the liberal state will be this neutral umpire that mediates fairly, quote unquote, between these other competing interests. And that we're not violent. We bring peace. We are the peacemakers. But as we just pointed out with the French and American revolutions, when this system of government was birthed, it was birthed in a Holocaust. I mean, that's probably not too hyperbolic at all. Look at the Napoleonic Wars and then the American westward expansion. The liberal state was born in a Holocaust, and it totally undercuts its pretext of being a peacemaker.
Yeah, and of course the rationale behind it is, well, they weren't as enlightened as we were. We couldn't help it because to have peace we had to have war. And again, that's a method of thinking that permeates liberal thought, even today. But if we look at the 20th century again, the World War I, the war to end all wars, that's how this kind of thinking seems to work. It's always about peace and justice and things like that. But there's always somebody that's benighted, that's in the way and keeping everything from working the way it should be. So we've got to get rid of them.
Yeah. So I think we're about out of time now. Is there anything you want to leave us with before we go?
Just that it is interesting to consider how violent American imperialism was, even in the early period of the United States. There's this common image that that a lot of people have, that the United States early on was sort of like this peaceful, almost libertarian-like republic. A lot of libertarians hold to this mythology. Even a lot of traditional conservatives, some leftists even hold to this kind of mythology. And then everything started going south over time as there was the United States evolved into an empire and things of this nature. But I think that if we really look at the actual history there, we see that essentially what happened in the late 18th and early 19th century was just a full-blown tribal warfare between the Americans and between the English Americans and between the Native Americans. And that in turn really set the precedent for what the American empire would become. It's always been an empire of expansionism and subjugation and domination.
Yeah, exactly. We were the first Jacobins.
Right.
But this is Todd Lewis signing off.